Good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers, Caroline Kielczewski and Erin Syverson. Caroline and Erin are genetic counselors at the Medical College of Wisconsin. Their clinical practices are through the Children's Wisconsin Genetics Clinic. They're both involved with the MCW Genetic Counseling Graduate Program. MCW is a teaching institution, and they embrace their roles as teachers, helping med students, medical residents, and genetic counseling students sort through exciting and somewhat difficult concepts. I was lucky to have them patiently impart genetics information with me when I worked with them, and I'm excited to have them here this morning to share information with all of you about this expanding topic.
Thanks, Lisa. Do you want to split over here? Okay, I'll go over here. It's fine. No, I think the camera will pick it up. Okay, well, I'm going to this camera. Okay, we see it. All right. And I think the mic will pick us up. Probably better. Do you want us to be a little bit closer to the mic?
We need to be closer to the mic.
All right.
Okay,
that
we can
do.
be closer to the mic. Okay.
Thank you, Lisa, for that introduction.
Let me see if this, all right,
Cool.
cool.
As Lisa mentioned, we are both genetic counselors, and we're here to talk about how you might encounter genetic testing in your everyday lives and what role we as genetic counselors play. So here's just a bunch of time covers showing how genetics is a thing that many lay people are interested in, and it can be really difficult to understand or to conceptualize how could this potentially affect me. My favorite one is the little baby that we'd see on the bottom row that says, "Want to know my future?" Because a lot of folks that we meet in our clinical practice feel that we can tell them exactly what's going to happen to their child in the future, and that's not the case at this point in time.
Or I just also love the forensic shows where they take a piece of hair and they can tell everything about you within a span of 3 hours. That is absolutely not, oh my gosh, where we are. So we're here just to kind of talk about the state of genetics, what clinical genetics looks like, but also spending a lot of time on talking about those direct-to-consumer tests, so those ones like 23andMe, the things that you can order off of the internet, and kind of what that means for you
as a consumer, potentially.
Yeah. So first and foremost, who are we? What are genetic counselors? Who are genetic counselors? So we are trained medical professionals that specialize in clinical genetics. So we have master's degrees specifically in genetic counseling, and genetic counselors work both in the clinic as well as in genetic testing labs, and our job really is to help people understand the role of genetics in their own healthcare and to help order and explain genetic testing results and kind of what that means for our patients and their families.
We are personalized healthcare, and we recognize that that's something that's been in the a general trend that's been talked about for many years, but when you meet with a genetic counselor or a genetics clinic, we will potentially do a DNA test to have a better understanding of how to help you specifically, and that's not something that might be true for the public or other family members. So we truly try to personalize the medical management and the genetic testing that we offer an individual.
Yep. Awesome. So what do genetic counselors do? Again, we meet with families. We work in a number of different specialties. So Caroline and I both are in the pediatrics department at Children's. So we meet a lot of kids with like autism and developmental delays and heart defects. But there are other genetic counselors who work, prenatally, working with people who are currently pregnant or hoping to become pregnant and knowing what sorts of genetic concerns that they might be at risk for. There's genetic counselors who work in neurology and cardiology and cancer. So trying to figure out what someone's individualized risk for cancers or certain types of heart disease are as well. Mm-hmm. So we meet with families, we ask them a bunch of questions. We will, depending on the situation, order genetic testing and help them understand their results. Other genetic counselors might, again, work in genetic testing labs where they're actually seeing the results and hoping to help people understand and write the reports that come to us on the clinical side.
Mm-hmm. What bullets did we write here?
Oh, there are bullet points.
Discuss
Don't
testing
mind me, it's
possibilities and
still,
options.
yep.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no, I
okay,
think that
great.
works, yeah.
Okay, awesome.
I think you covered all of that.
Don't mind me, guys. Okay.
Let's do a little science refresher first, now that we know what genetic counselors do. I like to think of DNA as a language that our body speaks, and this is the analogy that I use with all the families that I meet with. And so if DNA is a language, a gene, another word you've heard used in the context of genetics, is a specific recipe written in that language. So how to make a heart, how is my liver supposed to work? And all of our genes, we have 20,000 of them, are stored on structures called chromosomes. So in this analogy, a chromosome is a recipe book. So you have specific books, specific pages, specific genes that are located on those pages. And when you think about genetic testing technologies, they all look at DNA in different layers or in different levels. One of the reasons why we wanted to start off with this picture as well is you see that all of these chromosomes come in pairs. And so when we say that a kiddo gets half of their DNA from mom and half of their DNA from dad, what that means in a practical sense is one chromosome number 1 is contributed by a mother, the other chromosome number 1 is contributed by dad. And so we have backup copies of all of our genes or of all of our recipes. All of our DNA is the same, if you wouldn't mind going back just one more.
Yep,
Except for that last pair where you see 2 X's and an X and a Y. So females have 2 X's, males have an X and a Y. Just because you have those chromosomes doesn't necessarily mean that you express that specific biological sex. So there are other pieces of DNA, other genes that influence how the body understands that Y chromosomal material or having 2X chromosomal material. So it's not as simple as it seems. It's not black and white necessarily. We go to the next slide. So on the top of this page where we see that long blue line, that's a cartoon of a chromosome. So the picture of what we were just looking at on the last slide. And when we think about genetic testing, we can do something like a chromosome analysis where we just count all of someone's chromosomes. The analogy, going back to my recipe book analogy, is that you just look at a bookshelf and count all of the books. It's a simple test. You get a good understanding of how many pieces of DNA someone has, but it's a really broad test. It's not as comprehensive as you would think that we can be. And so by zooming in a little bit, we now come to the part of this picture where there's a lot of little blue and gray lines. That type of analysis is something called a chromosomal microarray. That's something that we run pretty regularly in our pediatric genetics clinic that looks for missing or extra pieces of DNA within the chromosome. And so it's a more detailed analysis than counting all the books on a bookshelf. You're holding a book by its spine, flipping through all the pages to make sure that all of the pages are there. If someone's missing pages or has extra pages, we can tell you what chapter, what region that's happening in, and what genes, what recipes you would expect to find in that chapter, and how we expect missing those recipes or having extra recipes can affect your growth and development. We used to think that having missing or extra DNA always had some kind of significant effect on someone, but we've been doing this layer of testing for the last 15 to 20-ish years, and we've been finding that almost everyone has a difference in the amount of DNA that they have. So having a missing or extra page doesn't always affect your growth or development. Sometimes if it's a really important gene that you're missing or a really important gene that you have duplicated or extra, that can affect the way that you grow and develop, but most of the time it's negligible. Sometimes the report comes back normal, and then there's a caveat that says, but you still do have some benign deletions or duplications of DNA. Zooming in a little bit closer, so now we're at the level where we see all the A's, T's, C's, and G's. If you all can see those, we recognize that it's a little bit small. This is the layer of testing that most of you think of when we talk about genetic testing. So this is proofreading the words on the page, looking to see, are there any spelling differences in your DNA? And this layer of technology can be done in many different ways, and that's part of what we'll talk about at the end today, just because sometimes you proofread the entire page, sometimes you just hit spell check in a Word doc and you get all the misspelled words and you kind of like, cool, it all works, I didn't misspell anything, I'm moving on. Sometimes you might have a word that's duplicated multiple times and word check doesn't necessarily pick that up. So there can be differences in your DNA, and the type of testing technology that you're using may not always identify what those differences are. And so that's where our role comes in, where we say, this is the type of most common molecular change, but the testing technology that was used can't pick up that change. And that's why we have a negative test, right? Or that's why we didn't identify what we expected to see. I think that's it for that. Yes.
Great. So there's going to be a little, I'm going to explain all the words on this page a little bit, but typically when we talk about well, I keep hitting this, I'm so sorry. Genetic influences of disease. We're biased. We think that most things have some degree of genetic influence, right? Except for things like car crashes, right? Like that's not genetic. But, things like autoimmune disease, your risk for diabetes,
Mental health
mental
disorders.
health concerns, height, weight, like all of that has a degree of genetic component. That's why we tend to look like our family members. But genetic testing isn't always good at finding all of these types of traits. So the things that genetic testing is typically good at finding right now are genetic changes where you have one big genetic change, and we know, thank you for moving that one, you have one kind of like heavy hitting big genetic change, and we know kind of what that's going to look like. So these are things like cystic fibrosis, sickle cell disease, Down syndrome, kind of like the genetic conditions that we typically think of when we think of like a child who has some sort of genetic condition. However, on the other side, and that's what we call like monogenic or Mendelian disorder. So basically, one genetic change influences pretty much the entire condition. But a lot of the things that people are interested in nowadays fall in more of what we call the complex category, where maybe it's not just one single genetic change influencing how we develop, but it's a lot of like hundreds or even thousands of smaller genetic changes that on their own might not make a difference, but together can add up to kind of influence how we develop. So again, things like height, weight, intelligence, mental health concerns, diabetes risk, and all of these things can also have environmental factors for them. So our genes are playing a role, but then also the environment that we grow up in will play a role as well. And then there's some conditions that can fall into both categories, where sometimes it's complex and due to a lot of different factors, and sometimes it can be due to kind of one heavy hitting genetic change. So certain types of heart disease, autism, for example. And the reason, and just to kind of put a visual to it, I love using this jar analogy for complex conditions, where basically if we think of us as a jar, and we only will start to show symptoms once the top of the jar is full. The yellow marbles in this picture are kind of our genetic factors, where again, alone, a yellow marble is not going to fill up the jar, but if we have 20 or 30 or 50 marbles, and then we start adding in some of these orange triangles, those are kind of things in our environment. So different types of like therapies we might get, or our diets, or do we have surgeries? I don't know, all sorts of things. Once we reach to the top of the jar, between a combination of environmental factors, those yellow marbles, and the environment, those orange triangles, once we reach to the top of the jar, we might start showing symptoms. And this is kind of a lot of different conditions fall into this category, and oftentimes are the types of conditions that a lot of people are interested in, because this is where we start talking about precision medicine. What is my risk for high cholesterol, for developing certain types of cancers, for diabetes, gallbladder disease, what have you. And again, like I said, the current knowledge state is that, we have
A good
understanding of like what genes are in our body. The Human Genome Project kind of mapped out where all of the genes are, but we still don't necessarily know what all of the genes do at this point.
That's why I like the recipe book analogy that I use, because who has done every recipe in a recipe book? Not all of them, at least not me. I'll call myself out,
Yeah,
right?
100%,
Maybe Erin, she's a cook. And so you always have that one recipe where you're like,
No,
I don't know what baklava is.
Mm.
How if I mess up this ingredient list or this set of instructions, will I not get the final product that I'm expecting to get, right? And that's true for our genome as well. There are genes where we say, we think this should look this way, or this should be involved in the body's growth and development this way, but we just don't know for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, and most of our knowledge right now is concentrating on kind of those, what we call those monogenic disorders. Again, the ones where like you mess with one particular gene and we know exactly what we're getting. And we're only really beginning to understand how the kind of like those complex conditions work, and how genes interact with each other. So talking about what does genetic testing actually do and what does that actually look like? Super basics, when we talk about genetic testing, a lot of times people are kind of concerned, oh my God, I still hit it even when we moved it out of the way.
It's all good.
Anyway, so a lot of questions that we get are about logistics, right? We're not taking any body part. We're not, it's not invasive. Typically what it means is, we, as a healthcare team, decide what testing is most appropriate for you, along with, kind of what you're hoping to get out of testing. We say, this is the testing we think would be best for you. We order that test from the lab. They get a sample. Usually it's a blood test. Sometimes it's a cheek swab or spitting in a tube. It gets sent to the lab. The lab then takes the DNA, kind of unravels it, reads it letter by letter, looking to see if there are any spelling changes in your DNA that makes it different than what we would expect to find. And then based off of that, will give us a report that says we found something or we didn't find something. And that's where, again, the genetic counselors come in saying, this is what that actually means for you.
When the lab looks at our DNA, they will identify changes because we all have DNA changes. And so there's a question of, has this change been associated with disease before? There are databases that classify pathogenic or condition-causing variants. Sometimes these are called mutations, that we know that this change definitely causes cancer. This change definitely causes heart disease, and that's a clear-cut association. There are other variants where we've seen them enough in the general population. Again, there are general population databases of quote-unquote healthy individuals where we know this variant is too common to be associated with whatever that health concern is. And so we can essentially dismiss it. Yes, it's unique, but we don't think of it as being associated with disease. That's benign at the bottom of this picture. In between pathogenic, so yes, definitely disease-causing, and benign, definitely not disease-causing, is this really
Our good
fun
friend, yep.
space that we live in, that's gray, called variant of uncertain significance. This is our way of saying, we think this DNA change could be informative because it's significant enough, but we don't have the data to prove it conclusively at this point in time. Maybe we don't have the structure of the protein that it's coding for. Maybe that specific type of change has never been seen before in the medical literature. It's not in any of our databases, and so we just don't know, is this truly the thing that's causing the health concerns or not? And that's really difficult for families, just because a lot of the families that we meet are on a diagnostic odyssey. We do a genetic test to help clarify what's going on with their kiddo. And if we get a VUS, it's well, we're still in the same place, right? We still have that question mark. We don't have a clear-cut answer for why your child has the concerns that they have. You'll notice that it says all classifications are fluid, and that's because over time, as more data accumulates, a VUS, so that question mark, will be reclassified as informative or benign. So over time, we're able to say, you know what, this was a red herring all the time. Back in 2025, this is the way that we thought about it. Now that we're in 2030, we're a lot smarter. This is how we're understanding this specific variant. Or the exact reverse could be true, and we say, you know what, this is our answer. Here's how we've learned it, or here are the other children who have been identified with this change and similar health concerns to your child, or to you as an adult with a health concern, and this is why we now think that this was our answer all along. We just weren't smart enough to rubber stamp it. Go ahead, I see you raising your hand.
Does that mean that with the patients that come in, you continue to analyze their DNA through the rest of their life?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So for those online, the question was, yeah, of course, for those online and for those here who didn't hear, if someone comes in and they have inconclusive test results, the question is, do we continually reanalyze someone's DNA? And the answer is yes and no. So it really depends on the lab that completed that testing. Certain labs are very good about issuing updated reports anytime that specific genetic change in their database is either upgraded or downgraded. They'll automatically issue an updated report, send it out to the provider that ordered that testing and says, hey, what used to be inconclusive is now informative, please contact your patient. Or is now benign, feel free to react to this information how you would want to react to it, right? We, in the pediatric side, we don't necessarily do that because our families are on a diagnostic odyssey. And you can imagine if you met with a genetic counselor, we did a test, we don't provide an answer for your child, we say, we're at the limit of the testing technology that we can do, we're at the limit of our knowledge at this point in time. You go home, you meet with us again in a year, and we say, we can redo that exact same test, but we're only a year smarter. There's still a chance that we're gonna go through this possible answer, but then we come up shorthanded again, right? And if you do that year after year after year after year, there's a lot of families who say, you know what, I'm gonna tap out for the next 5 years because I've been getting my quote unquote hopes up on an annual basis, and this has been a letdown. And that, for my mental health, isn't the best thing to do. Whereas other families say, let's keep doing it every year until we figure it out. And that's where we as genetic counselors say both of those avenues, and those are obviously the two polar opposites, are appropriate, and it really depends on what you as a family are looking to gain from a genetics consult. So it depends.
Yeah.
It's the shorthand.
Yeah, we've learned a lot even in the past 10 years. And so one realm that kind of rapidly grows is, for example, like our knowledge of cancer genetics. And so someone who had a genetic test because they had, really unusual cancer like 10 years ago and they had a negative test and it's been 10 years, that would definitely be something we would probably want to rerun a test because our knowledge in that space has grown so much. So it's kind of more on a patient by patient basis.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm trying to get a handle on just how much information you're dealing with. If we had to print
So
it
are
out,
we.
if we had to print it out, how big of a book would a person's genome be?
It's 3 billion. The question is, how much data are we actually reviewing? It's 3 billion pieces of DNA, but we are not looking at all of that. So the lab will sequence all of someone's DNA, but then it's a bioinformatics pipeline, so computers, algorithms that essentially weed out common variants, more concerning variants, and spit something out. Those algorithms are specific to the lab that's completing the testing, which is why not all labs are created equal. Not all labs have the same database to compare DNA variants to. We wish the entire world played nicely in the sandbox and there was just one database where everyone could upload every informative finding and then you could just check it against that and we'd all be happy. But in reality, a lot of this information is behind a paywall, and so it takes a lot of effort to be able to access it. We as genetic counselors on a report will typically get 2 to 3 VUSs that we then need to do a deep medical literature dive into to say, could this be informative for our child? Are there any research opportunities out there that we should be talking to family about to enroll them to clarify a VUS? I think the most VUSs that I've seen have been like 25, like a ridiculous number of them.
Yeah.
And that's unmanageable for us, right? Because that's just one patient that we get that many uncertain results for.
And
You mentioned bioinformatics.
Yes.
Is that what this is called?
A bioinformatics
it's
pipeline.
like it's one step of the process. So
Yes.
when we talk about genetic testing, you have, of course, the people on the healthcare side like us who are ordering the test. You have people on the lab side that are actually with like the pipettes and the machines and stuff actually extracting the DNA. The DNA, or like the machines will spit out the raw data, and then you have really smart PhDs who actually are in charge of figuring out how to filter through that data with the help of computers. They narrowed the interesting sort of like data that they find. They find a few interesting variants. Then it goes back to another genetic counselor on the lab side who will say, this is what we think about that. It'll come back to the clinic. We'll interpret that and then talk to the family about what that means.
So it's a lot.
I
Yes.
noticed that's a program offered at Northern Michigan University, right?
Sure. Yeah. Bioinformatics is becoming a more regularly both undergrad and graduate field of study, and not just from a genetic standpoint.
Yeah, it doesn't have to
because
be
you can use programming to filter through anything.
Like any sort of research data.
Yeah. Other questions?
Does it look like AI is going to really help with this stuff?
Oh my gosh, yes, that's a great question. So, yes and no. Okay, so to kind of the point, so yes, because there's no way that a human will know what every single one of our 3 billion letters are. So AI has been used in genetic testing results interpretation for a long time, but in a very narrow sense where it just kind of would be the one to do kind of the grunt work more or less of mining the databases and saying like, oh, you don't have to go and manually see how common this variant is. We'll do the math for you. And they'll spit out like all the stats that they need in order to make like a more cognitive approach to it. So AI is really helpful in that way, and has been used for a long time. Where we're getting into the kind of dangerous realm is a lot of the testing that you might buy off of the internet, and send your DNA in, and you'll get these like 50-page long reports that say, here are your genetic variants and here's all the things that you can do about it. That is dangerous because a lot of the like the recommendations that are coming from AI and not from a human saying that this is what you should do. So the AI will take it and be like, this person has this variant. I'm gonna mine through all of these papers. I have found one paper that mentioned this gene and I'm gonna stick this recommendation, and it can be really dangerous. I've seen some kind of, in my opinion, kind of like horrifying things come from like these direct-to-consumer companies. Some are better than others, where they have more people behind the scenes and they're very picky about what they put on their reports. But I've seen ones where there's just no way to keep up with the demand of the people who are ordering this test, so they're using AI to write these reports, and someone might go through and check and make sure that there's nothing blatantly wrong with the technology that was used, but the actual recommendations that are put on the report are kind of, yeah. So it's very helpful, but it's kind of getting away from us a little bit.
Yeah.
At least not on the clinical side, I wouldn't
Yes,
say.
but
If
on
you,
a
but on
DTC.
the direct-to-consumer, spit in a tube and send it to a lab side, yeah, the AI is starting to run rampant, in my opinion. Great questions.
We're gonna move on.
Yeah,
Obviously.
because we're going to get to that, actually.
Yeah.
You're kind of foreshadowing. Right, so this is kind of getting into, so when we talk about genetic testing, part of our job is making sure that we're choosing the right test for the right person. And just super quickly talking about two different types of technology. One, Caroline alluded to, the sequencing, looking at a gene letter by letter, looking for spelling changes. The other big one that we talk about is called genotyping, which is basically spot checking specific points of interest in the genome. So it's not actually reading a whole sentence, it's just gonna pick out a few letters and being like, is that there, yes or no? Yep, and give a very surface level, very specific questions that we want to have answered. Both are valid tests, but they need to be chosen for the right reason. Do you want to be comprehensive, or are you looking for quick yes or no answers on very specific questions? And the challenge is, again, with any genetic test, is that we have still an incomplete understanding of how genetic changes influence health. And again, our knowledge in some conditions is much better than others.
And we have a limited grasp.
Us on human diversity, and like, so genetic testing in someone who is of European or white background is going to oftentimes be much more informative than someone who is not, because most of the data we have is on white populations, and so we tend to get a lot more uncertain variants in people who are of basically any other ancestry or ethnicity besides just like white European. So that is a major challenge facing the genetics field right now. And like I said, this is just kind of visual. We're very good at finding the big yellow marbles that fill up the entire jar. That's things like Down syndrome, cystic fibrosis, sickle cell disease. We are not very good at finding the little yellow marbles, which is where a lot of people are interested in, and where a lot of direct-to-consumer testing kind of plays a role. So again, we kind of talked about the difference. Clinical testing is selected through a healthcare provider, your doctor, a genetic counselor, someone like that. And it's deemed medically necessary for what's going on with your current symptoms at this point. And it's ordered to answer a specific question. Why is this child having seizures? Why does everyone in my family have cancer at the age of 20? You know, things like that. And it's used for medical management. Whereas direct-to-consumer testing is initiated by the consumer. They might be interested in a genetic test. They want to know more about their genetic makeup. It's not ordered by a healthcare provider. It's sent to a lab directly from the consumer to a lab. It's oftentimes not used for a specific reason. Even if the consumer wants a specific answer, that's not necessarily the purpose of the test. And again, it's kind of more for curiosity, and it's not necessarily tailored towards your own medical management. Couple examples of some direct-to-consumer companies you might have heard of: 23andMe, Ancestry.com, Sequencing.com.
GEDmatch.
There's ones that'll tell you like what wine you should drink based on, like, it's just like, anyway, try some wine, see what you like. Yes, exactly. So how does direct-to-consumer testing work? Again, it depends on the company. So some direct-to-consumer companies are using sequencing where again, they're opening the DNA and looking letter through letter, sometimes at your entire genome, sometimes at only specific genes that they are offering to test you for. A lot of genetic testing companies, though, use that genotyping, so just spot checking, not actually sequencing everything, but just looking at a very limited number of spots in the genome. And the reason I'm bringing this up so strongly is because that can introduce some limitations, which we'll talk about. But before that, I just want to say, on the clinical side, we are very much in favor of genetic testing being ordered in a safe an ethical way. We're not necessarily against direct-to-consumer testing, but there are some cautions that we think that people need to be aware of. So again, arguments for direct-to-consumer testing, it really reduces access barriers for people learning about their genetic information, and knowing about your own genetic information is a right. And I think
It's convenient.
Yep. And it's cheaper than, clinical testing. Let's see. It can actually help us learn more about like kind of genetic diversity as well. And then I'm just trying to make sure
It might identify something that wouldn't have been picked up otherwise, and then you bring that up to your healthcare provider and say, hey, I do have this increased risk, or seemingly have this increased risk for a cancer of some kind.
Yep. Oh, that's against it, actually. Sometimes people can find out family secrets that they weren't expected. We put it on the wrong side. This is actually an argument against direct-to-consumer testing. An increasing number of people have come up in clinic. They'll be like, oh yeah, I have like a bunch of like half-siblings that I didn't know about. I found out my father wasn't my father. Like, all these sorts of things that you don't think is ever going to happen to you until you take a test thinking you're going to find out if you're Norwegian or not, and then all of a sudden you find out that your family is not actually your family.
Yeah.
Which is, it happens, like,
speaking,
right, yeah, right, yes, thank you. So yeah, arguments kind of against it, again, it's imperfect quality, it's not regulated the same way as clinical testing. Oftentimes, like, consumers might not understand exactly what they're ordering, and and there's some privacy concerns. 23andMe, for example, their entire board just quit, and questions about whether or not that company is going to go over and what's going to happen to all the data of millions of people that they have in their databases. So there's a lot of reasons why people might do direct-to-consumer testing, but there's also like a number of legitimate concerns about it.
The third bullet point was what Erin was alluding to by saying AI just spits out a report. It's not human eyes that are looking at your health concerns, comparing it to your genomic data and saying, this is what makes sense for you. It's just a computer saying, here you go, this is what I found about this DNA change, do with it what you will. Which can be really upsetting, yeah.
Right, so our first caution point is that I'm sorry, this is really small, a lot of direct-to-consumer testing claims to be able to give you really detailed information about complex conditions. So again, complex conditions being things like risk for high cholesterol, diabetes, mental health concerns, things that are not well understood even by the clinical genetic side. They'll be able to say, oh, we found this genetic change in you, you must be at increased risk. And they'll get these ultra detailed reports. And so, for example, they might say, oh, a direct-to-consumer company found that your risk of heart attacks is 4% higher than the general population because you have this particular variant, and that particular variant has been found in people who have had heart attacks. But what they kind of sometimes fail to explain thoroughly is that they might have only looked at 2 or 3 variants that have been associated with heart attacks, and you might have hundreds more that could put you either at more increased risk or actually be protective, because some people are just kind of born with less risk for heart attacks, and they're not taking that into consideration. They're just looking at a couple things and spitting out a risk number without looking at the entire picture. And they're basing this off of incomplete understanding. It's like trying to do like a 500-piece puzzle, but you only have 200 of the pieces, and you don't even know what half of those even mean. Yeah. And saying like, oh, this is what it's mean. Yes, exactly. So, big caution point there. Caution point 2, again, some people, they'll be testing for something very specific, and they might only use genotyping. So again, looking at a couple specific variants instead of comprehensively looking at those genes. And so there's been instances where consumers have bought a direct-to-consumer test thinking that they're getting comprehensive testing for something that they're worried about, and then it turns out that that wasn't the case.
So the classic example is 23andMe only looks at the 3 most common pathogenic variants in BRCA1 or 2. And these 3 variants are common to individuals who have an Ashkenazi Jewish ethnic background. They are not
and that includes, it causes an increased risk for breast
cancer,
breast and ovarian cancer.
Yes, but it's not something that's common in the general population. And so someone who doesn't have Ashkenazi Jewish background may do this test, think to themselves, I was negative, so I'm good to go, but there's another common variant that isn't included in this testing that that individual may have, and this test didn't identify it because that's not what it's supposed to do, right? It's looking at 3 common mistakes that you were never going to have because you don't have that background. And so that's where 23andMe can really fail.
Well, it's not, we're
Yeah.
crapping on
Yes,
23. I mean,
yeah.
this is not just like
Yeah.
specifics,
23andMe,
but
yeah.
this was a real example of what happened is
Yeah.
that like they advertised that we do BRCA 1 and 2 testing. And if anyone's familiar, that's the changes in gene that like Angelina Jolie has or whatever that puts her at increased risk for breast cancer. And there's a lot of families that have these risks, and people thought like, oh, I know I have a family variant in BRCA. The genetics clinic, so expensive.
Yeah.
It takes a long time.
I can do this
I'm just
quick
gonna
test.
send in the spit kit. They came back negative.
I'm
Of
good to
course,
go.
they're negative because they're not Jewish. Their
Yeah.
family has a different variant. So they thought they were negative falsely, stopped their mammograms, ended up getting cancer. And this happened in a number of patients because they just didn't
Understand,
and a lot
yeah.
of that's on 23andMe for not being explicit enough about what exactly they were testing for, but also genetics is really complicated, as you hopefully can imagine. And so a lot of, if you don't have like a lot, a strong background in genetics, you might not even you think like, oh, I got the BRCA test,
I'm good.
to go. When in reality, you were only tested for 1% of all the variants that could potentially be
Yeah, in
concerning
one of
for
the
you.
genes.
Yeah, in one of the
that is
genes.
associated with an increased breast cancer risk, yeah.
Yep. And then,
Yep, and that's what we just
yeah.
talked about, yeah.
And then final caution point, direct-to-consumer companies don't know your background like your doctor knows you. Even if they find a genetic change that they think is concerning and that you should know about, they don't know how to contextualize it in terms of your family history or your history. So let's just say, for example, because we've seen this before where direct-to-consumer companies might be like, hey, you have this genetic variant, I think you might benefit from this supplement or this medication. And people are like, great, that's really personalized, helpful, thank you. They start taking that medication, but your doctor knows that that medication is actually dangerous for the kidneys, for example, and you have a family history of kidney disease, and so they would have actually put you on a different medication because that wouldn't be harmful to the kidneys. And so, again, anytime you're ordering a test outside of care with your healthcare provider, just know that these are people who don't know you at best, or computers who do not know you at worst. So, how we would recommend using direct-to-consumer testing if you're interested in it as genetic providers,
Yeah.
utilizing it for its intended purposes. So if you're looking for if you're curious about something, find a direct-to-consumer company that specializes in that specific thing, if there is such a thing, and then and paying attention to how thorough their testing is. But more than anything, using any results as a jumping off point to talk to your healthcare provider. Don't just take the results and run with it and take it for truth. Make sure that you're talking to your healthcare provider, because oftentimes they would want to confirm the results are true, or at least talk to you about whether or not they think that's important for you to follow recommendations.
Yeah, or guidance.
Yep. Please do not attempt to analyze your raw data. Do not download it and stick it into another website. Those exist, where you'll see advertisements that say like, oh, did you have sequencing.com or 23andMe? Download your file and upload it to our website, and we'll analyze it all for you in another way.
No.
Absolutely not. Do not do that. Please do not do that. Privacy concerns, not only, but also for quality issues. Oftentimes they'll just say, do you have a rare variant, aka less than 50% of the
Yeah.
population? Yes, that's automatically bad. And
Yeah.
then they'll make,
Or you trying to sequence, or using a sequence informatic pipeline on
Yeah.
genotype data, and
Yeah.
that's just never gonna
yeah,
work. Yeah.
right, exactly. Yeah, it's complicated.
Yeah.
And then again, recognizing the limitations of these tests and being very careful and, what did I say there? Yeah, and just recognize that if a company says like, I'll be able to tell you exactly what your risks are for these complex conditions, just automatic sort of like red flag, knowing that we're at best working off of incomplete information, and there's a reason that even clinics aren't able to offer this testing. It's just because our knowledge isn't there yet. So just kind of being wary and using it again as a jumping off point more than a hard truth.
Yeah.
So finally,
Went to see a genetics clinic. You want to hit the bullet points?
yes.
So you have a personal history of, let's say, cancer or a heart attack that seems unusually early, or you have a family history of heart attacks, cancer, something going not the way that you would expect it to earlier on in life, or a single individual with multiple cancers, or a child who doesn't have typical development or is born with some congenital anomalies, all good reasons to talk to your primary care provider just to say, hey, I'd like to meet with a genetics group. Oh, and that's just everything that's it, yeah. The other reason to meet with a genetic counselor is difficulty getting pregnant or having multiple losses. Prenatal genetic counselors or reproductive medicine genetic counselors are able to review whatever data there is about those losses just to potentially give you an explanation for why that happened, and then discuss what type of screening would benefit you to hopefully have a successful pregnancy. And then, or if you're planning on having a pregnancy and want to know ahead of time if you're a carrier of genetic condition. This personally, I find that a lot of my friends who are planning families typically get carrier screening when they find out that they're pregnant. And that's a little bit too late because all of us are carriers of a certain number of autosomal recessive conditions. And so being pregnant for the first time, finding out you're a carrier for cystic fibrosis and maybe spinal muscular atrophy and something else, and then having to wait weeks for your partner to be tested for you to then have a conclusion to that question of, do I have this? Does my child potentially have this disorder or not? It can be really anxiety provoking. So if you're family planning, consider meeting with a genetic counselor to coordinate carrier screening prior to starting that, just to save yourself a little bit of worry in the long run, I find. Because again, we're all carriers of something.
Right, and so
Yeah.
we're learning more every day. So if there's something even that you're just like, man, everyone in my family tends to get this, or everyone in my family has this, that would be worth a question to your doctor about whether or not that's something that genetics can even help you with. If everyone in your family has high cholesterol, maybe not. It depends. You know, like there's some rare cases where that can be.
Yeah.
Like, you know, you're having heart attacks at the age of 30, you know, you're really healthy and you have no reason for having high cholesterol, maybe, but if everyone gets high cholesterol at the age of like 70 or 80, that's probably not, you know, something that genetics would be able to help you with. But, you know, everyone in my family has Parkinson's disease, like everybody. Everyone in my family had cancer at the age of 40. My child has seizures or heart defect or whatever, all reasons to see a genetics clinic, and we can facilitate that clinical testing. And
meeting with a genetics clinic does not mean that you're agreeing
Yes.
to genetic testing. That's the other thing. So it's just a conversation about what testing capabilities we can offer you and whether that's something that you want to pursue at this
Correct.
point in time. We at our institution will always prior authorize any genetic testing that we're recommending. And so again, if insurance says yes, then you get the choice to say, do I still want to do this, right? Just because they've covered the service doesn't mean that your out-of-pocket cost is $0. Go ahead.
Yeah, I know there's federal law protecting privacy and testing and research, but how about in clinical care as far as getting insurance, health insurance, life insurance?
Yep, that would be, it's been in place since 2008.
Yeah.
GINA, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. So basically that says that there's there's limitations to it, but basically if you are found to have a genetic predisposition to something or you have a genetic condition, you can't be hired or fired based off of it. You can't have your health care, taken away, you can't be denied health care, and your insurance premiums can't be raised. But it doesn't apply to life insurance or long-term disability insurance. So if you're someone who wants genetic testing and you know that there's a possibility you can come back with a predisposition, we encourage people to think about, maybe taking out a policy or like life insurance policy prior to the results coming back in case it were to be something that could be discriminated. I don't know how often discrimination actually happens. I know that it does happen. I don't know how routine it is.
Yeah.
We can't release records to an insurance company to say, if they ask for it and say, should I deny this person, we can't
Without
release
your
it.
explicit
we
agreement,
can't
right,
release that information. So it's not like we keep a database and send it off to the insurance companies to say like, don't cover this person or anything like that. But
So there's multiple layers of protections, and I have families who ask really detailed questions. I've said, consider speaking to a lawyer about this, just because that's my knowledge base, right? There is a protection in place, and that the federal act, Wisconsin had a similar act protecting individuals prior to 2008, and so I assume if that federal act were to dissolve overnight, the Wisconsin act would then apply. But I'm not a lawyer, right? And I don't know how that would work out legally. And so it's always a good question just to ask. And we often tell families to be more cautious in that situation if you're thinking and asking those questions, rather than just saying, let's just jump into testing. Other exclusions are smaller companies who have
Like
less than
15
15 employees.
And the military.
And I was gonna say the federal government, I think it
Yeah.
might be broader than the military, but, you know, think about it before diving into genetic testing.
Yeah, a lot of times people will start being like, oh, I'm gonna figure out again, like what my genetic ancestry is, and then
Yeah.
all these things down the line. And a lot of the kids that we see in clinic have significant disabilities, which may or may not actually impact their ability to get insurance more than a genetic testing result, but oftentimes, a lot of times, the testing that we do for kids can also involve genetic testing their parents, and that can also, it becomes like a familial affair, and that's where it can really start to have unintended consequences from a insurance and legal perspective.
I think that was it.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you have other questions, so. Yeah.
That's.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Oh, yay.
How about we start at the front and
Yeah.
we'll work our way back? Go ahead.
Like, you're talking about genotyping versus just sequencing.
Yes.
Why beat around the bush? Is it gonna come when sequencing is so cheap that we just all get our whole genome sequenced? And
Yeah.
that's all just part of it?
Who's storing that data is the problem.
What?
Who is storing that data? Because it's 3 billion pieces of DNA, so it's gonna be it's not a thumb drive, right?
The way the things are going now.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah. Well,
yeah.
also part of it is like specific, like, yeah, to your point, like it's almost just as cheap to get everything
Yes,
sequenced.
yeah.
So sometimes the factors aren't always necessarily just financial. It really is kind of like what's best for the patient. And sometimes patients are really anxious and they don't want to open that can of worms, and they want just like, you know, I have something in my family, there's this one particular variant, and we can be like, great, let's order that test, give you a yes or no, and not like muck around with other different
Yeah.
genes. And there's some conditions where, again, there's maybe 4 or 5 particular spots in the genome that can cause that condition, and they're like, I don't want anything to do with genetic testing, but I'll do it just because I want to know like this specific answer. So,
Yeah, but if there are 7 billion people in the world, I mean, just as a statistic,
Oh.
everybody had all their, had everybody sequenced, and they do all the statistical analysis correlating everything with
Oh, yeah.
every disease. I mean, that's part of the.
There
So-
are
so a lot of
certain
research, yeah.
studies like that. So the All of Us research study, have you heard of it? It's yeah, it's where I've done it. So you go, you get a physical exam, you submit some blood, they run some regular tests, they also do some genetic testing for you, and you get certain results from that, but that isn't clinical testing, right? So if my genetic testing from that came back saying, let's say I had an increased likelihood for breast cancer, I would still need to meet with a cancer genetic counselor to complete a clinical test to prove that that genetic change is actually there, and that the research platform isn't mislabeling the change that they identified as condition causing for me.
but from like a research perspective,
Yeah.
yeah, like to the point, like why can't we just genotype everyone and get
Yeah.
everything figured out? Partially manpower, funding, and
Mm-hmm.
also, you know, sometimes, especially with these complex conditions, there's just literally infinite number of combinations of different genetic variants plus environmental factors
Yeah.
that even with all the numbers, some of these things might not still be a complete understanding, or we might have not a complete understanding of everything, even to the point where even if we had a number of like, oh, you know, like this variant might increase your risk 1%, and this variant might increase your risk 1%, like the combination that you have in your body versus the combination that I might have in my body is gonna be so
Yeah.
individualized.
Yes,
That's like
yeah.
where, and then, you know, the medications you're on that are
Yeah,
influencing that. So like,
yeah.
how do you start to like,
It's very nuanced.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I have a question about gene therapy.
Yes.
You have a corrected gene. How does that gene get to the billion cells in your body? How does it get there?
That's a great question.
it doesn't,
depends.
it does.
No, I mean,
Well,
like,
it depends on the, well, yeah,
it
because
depends
that's,
on the condition, depends on the type of therapy, because someone who has a
Yeah.
bone marrow transplant,
Yes.
it is going to be present in certain parts of their body.
right, but there is
Yeah.
not like a way to, that's why there's some conditions that are much more amenable to gene therapy than others, where it's an isolated body system. So for example, a lot of things in the eye, because like the eyes are a fairly isolated body system and it's really easy to access. You know, you can deliver a viral vector and it'll go into a lot of different cells and swap out the non-working copy for a healthy copy. And then going forward, every gene or every cell that has that working copy should hopefully work. So something like isolated to the bone marrow, isolated to the eyes, are going to be a lot more feasible than something that is affecting your entire body, which is why there's not, you know, a gene therapy for something like Down syndrome, because you can't really just replace
Or remove a chromosome
so,
in all
or
of your cells.
remove a chromosome from all your cells. And the other thing to consider is whether or not the damage, for lack of a better word, but like the symptoms are even treatable going forward, because if sometimes there's genetic conditions that the gene is only turned on like in utero, and that non-functioning gene, it doesn't matter if you replace it after you know, after the child is born, because like that gene already had its effects. So it's the conditions of, is it actually going to be helpful moving forward? Is it going to be able to slow, stop, or even reverse the condition? And yeah, and then how deliverable is it?
And so it's not always a viral vector. There are different
Yeah.
ways to get that fixed quote unquote gene in. And it's not that they're often replacing the entire gene.
Yeah.
They're changing the spelling of the part of the word to get it to function or to work. And that's for some genetic conditions.
Yeah, there's
others you replace the entire gene.
yeah, or you just add a working copy and
Yes,
leave the
yeah.
non-working copy. Yeah, it's just it's very
It's
complex.
very nuanced, which is why it's not readily available for all disorders.
I mean, even
Yeah.
in the eye, how many millions of cells are there? How does the one little thing you stick in there know to get to all these other?
So with a viral vector, certain viruses have this ability to put themselves into someone's DNA, and that's the type of vector that they're using, I think, in this instance. I might be misspeaking. And so it attacks everything. It's kind of like ibuprofen affects your entire body. You're just taking it for your headache, and the headache goes away, but it's everywhere in your body, right? The ibuprofen doesn't know to go to your headache. And so the same thing is true for a viral vector. It goes everywhere, and because it's an isolated system, you know that there aren't going to be any unintended consequences. That viral vector isn't going to jump into your muscles, right?
Well, it might
This is
not
just-
be it might not be in every single eye cell either. It could be that
True.
they
Yeah.
only need a working copy in 10% or 20% in order for there to, you know, oftentimes our genes in our body are not working at 100% capacity, but we're able to get by with 90 or 80 or whatever
Yeah.
percent. And
Or what has always been mind-blowing for me, individuals with hemophilia,
Yeah.
they require transfusions, right? So they have enough working platelets. To not have hemophilia, you just need more than 1% of working platelets. And that's insane, right? You just need to be above 1% and you're good to go. That's wonderful. And so that's the goal with individuals who have hemophilia, why they get those regular transfusions. Whereas the rest of us, if you're at 10%, you're golden, right? Yes, go ahead.
On the research side, any genetic testing done on animals relevant to humans?
Yes.
that's basically how it all happens.
Yeah.
It's not a perfect, you know, genetic research either happens like retroactively, where you have enough people with the same thing, and then we look at their genes and see what they have in common. But then when you're actually trying to figure out like, oh, I think I know what this gene does, but I'm not sure, that's where animal models might come in, where you change a gene in a fly or a mouse or something like that, like their version of platelet genes for hemophilia. You change it in a mouse. Oh, that's what happened when we changed that. Now we can see what's going on. So yeah, sometimes it's, again, research is more tons of data, let's see what we can find, and sometimes it's a little bit more, let's do experiments and then see what happens afterwards.
And it's not typically just one animal model. You'll
Yes.
start with something
Like
simple like
zebrafish.
zebrafish, which are tiny fish, and then you'll move to mice, and then you'll move to canines, dogs, and then you'll have a human research study. So there's a lot of steps in there, Any other questions? Yeah.
How has your study of genetics influenced your spiritual beliefs?
Ooh, that's a good
Well,
one.
that's-
I have
Oh, shoot.
been, so I work in the NICU a lot. I meet a lot of families who are making really difficult decisions very early on in their child's life. And I am always surprised by how candid and open they choose to be, how a lot of them use their faith to help inform their decisions, and how it's really lovely to see how families come to make those decisions, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And that has informed my faith in that I see that some people are just willing to kind of let it all go. It's like, oh, okay, I don't have to be in control of everything. Let's see how this plays out. And for me, for someone who likes to be in control a lot, that's really helpful. I don't necessarily know that it's influenced by practice of a religion or of any type of spiritual. But yeah, it's it's interesting to see how faith plays an important role in others' lives. And I think that allows me to potentially be more vulnerable to those types of influences in my own life. Does that make sense?
What I
Yeah,
was, what
yeah.
I was looking for, do you think this is evidence of the existence of God?
I think that people, it's actually something that I was asked like in a grad school interview, which was really heavy. Yeah, but yeah, I think that scientists can fall in like one of two camps. Like I have just always kind of been on the more skeptical side, and I've always been very much understanding or like looking for scientific reasons for things. And for me personally, when I find something that we don't understand from a science perspective, you know, that isn't like frustrating to me. I just think like, oh, we just haven't gotten to the answer yet. Whereas like a lot of other scientists see how incredibly complex it is and say, there's no way that like anything but a divine being could have, designed something like that. And so for me, it hasn't really influenced it, but I can absolutely 100% understand why something as complex and as scientific as this is can also drive someone to become more spiritual, more faithful, and more like stronger in their religious beliefs. It just hasn't happened for me because
You are who you are.
I'm me.
Yeah, yes, go ahead.
Yeah.
I'm curious about, say, two people that want to get married and are concerned about genetic diseases, as you know now, that their children can have. Are there people like getting tested before they get married to see if some recessive genes
Yeah.
could come into play?
There can be. I don't know that people necessarily do that before they start family planning, before they have that conversation. But it's definitely a conversation that folks are having when they are thinking about their reproductive health, to just do broad carrier screening. It used to be ethnicity or ancestry based. We would offer screening for these specific disorders, but now we're just doing pan-ethnic screening because we recognize that everyone is a carrier of something. The difficult thing, and again, I work a lot in the NICU, is that a lot of the disorders that we see kiddos born with aren't inherited from their parents. It's a new genetic change that is just present in that child. And there's no way to screen for that until you have a child in front of you and you say, I see certain clinical concerns that fall in line with Rubinstein-Taybi syndrome. I'm concerned that this child has a new genetic change, and that is the disorder that we want to test them for. And there's no way to prevent that from happening. DNA is supposed to change from generation to generation. It'd be a boring place if we were all carbon copies of our parents. And DNA doesn't have any morality, right? It is. It changes from generation to generation. And yes, it can cause new health concerns and a more complex life for a family because they have a child who has additional needs. But it also can, be something that they find joy in. And so, yeah, that's the difficult thing about carrier screening. It doesn't rule out the fact that your child is going to have perfect DNA, right?
But if they were to find something, if they were to find that they're carriers,
Going back to your question.
sometimes people will just say, I'm okay with that, and knowing what my risk,
Listen, it wouldn't be the end of the session without you.
but other people take other steps where they'll decide on using sperm donation instead if they want to lower those chances, or something like IVF, in vitro fertilization, where they can, fertilize an embryo, create an embryo, do genetic testing, and only implant the ones that are not impacted by that genetic condition. So, or adoption. The other thing that also came to mind is that there are certain communities that historically have used like genetic information to determine who's a good match or if they should get married or not. So, some of the more Orthodox Jewish communities, for example, have a program called Doria Yeshorim, where they'll get kids will actually get carrier screening during high school for conditions that are common in the Jewish community. And those results are actually held by the rabbi. And when they're courting or considering marriage, they'll call the rabbi and say, hey, we're considering getting married, and the rabbi will say like, you are or you are not a good match, and they might not actually explain what the results are, but they'll know that they're carriers of the same condition and make decisions based off of that. And I think that that program is particularly unique because that program wasn't something that was forced upon the community. It was something that was a big conversation where they realized in their community there was a large incidence of a certain type of genetic conditions that was devastating for the community, and they decided together collectively like this is something that we want to do, and not all Jewish communities partake in that. It's kind of individualized, and they make a decision for themselves, but there's been other forced genetic testing programs throughout history where people were forced for their own good to have genetic testing, and that was not necessarily the decision of the community itself. It was people coming in from the outside and saying, we need to take care of this, or we need to know about this. And so Dor Yeshorim is beautiful in its sense because it was actually the community deciding that this is what they wanted to do. But that's the only one that I really know of where there's like that.
Anything else? Yeah.
Yeah. Iceland?
Yeah, I mean, the population's a little, I guess, inbred, but
Yeah.
I guess there's dating apps you can
Oh,
see.
oh yeah, I heard of that actually. I did. I heard of whisperings of that. I was like, oh my god, my genetic counseling heart just had some ethical heart attacks there. Yeah.
Are there a lot of diseases that you can associate with particular races? You mentioned two, but are like every race?
No,
Yeah, well,
but there are some. So individuals of a certain ethnic background have a higher likelihood of being a carrier. So individuals who are of a Black background have an increased likelihood of being a carrier for sickle cell disease. And I want to say that's 1 out of 9. We are not
12.
prenatal genetic
1 out of
counselors. 1 out of 12.
to 11, somewhere around there.
We don't know these numbers off the top of our heads. Cystic fibrosis for individuals of a white background, I think that's close
And
to
Ashkenazi Jewish.
yeah, it's 1 out of 30,
25.
25. We're making up numbers as we go along.
25.
But someone who's looking at something that's 1 out of 10, right? That you just need 10 other individuals to find another individual who's a carrier, versus 1 out of 25, you have a larger pool of people to choose from before you find that carrier. We deal with the rarest of the rare. So I've met families where the likelihood of being a carrier is 1 out of 1,000,000. That's just luck of the draw, right? That your partner happens to be a carrier of the exact same
thing.
very rare genetic disorder that you are a carrier for. And you can use that information to inform your reproductive health moving forward. But the carrier screening that we were talking about before isn't testing for all of those autosomal recessive conditions, right?
That are
It's
like
not
1 in a
testing for
million.
1 out of 1 in a million. It's going for the common disorders.
The cystic fibrosis,
Yeah.
the Tay-Sachs,
Yeah.
things like-
Historically, testing used to be ancestry-based just because it was cheaper. If you only have $5, I want to make sure that you get the biggest bang for your buck, and so I'm going to use your ancestry to inform what kind of testing I'm going to offer you. Whereas now, because testing's a lot cheaper, again, we're doing pan-ethnic testing.
And also, so everybody else has so much ancestry that they're not even aware of. They think
Yes,
they're
fair,
100%
yes.
Polish, and it turns out that way
Yeah.
back when there was whatever. And
Yeah.
we've seen people who have sickle cell disease who had no idea that they had any sort of African background whatsoever.
Yeah.
And so it just at this point, we just don't rule out. There might be certain things that are oh, this person has this particular ancestry. I'll keep that in the back of my mind, but not necessarily
Yeah.
going to make testing decisions based off of it. Well, thank you for your questions.
Yeah.
I really appreciate it.
We're a little late, so thanks.
Sorry.
No, thanks for